From the news team at LinkedIn, I'm Jessie Hempel, and this is Hello Monday, a show about work on our own terms. We've got an important episode to start the year. Now, if you're anything like me, you have spent a lifetime pleasing other people. I mean, most of us learned to do this when we were really tiny. I remember being a little girl and having my parents tell me to be good, be nice. And part of being good and nice meant going along with people, even when I really didn't want to give my great aunt a hug after dinner or read that book that my father really wanted me to read. And that has landed me here as an adult who still has a really hard time voicing my own opinion, especially when it involves saying no to someone more powerful than me. And look, let me be real with you. The consequences of saying no can be tough, and they're much greater for some of us. But owning our defiance, digesting it, defining it, expressing it, it's going to imbue us with a quiet authority. It will become your power move. So today, we're going to have a lesson in how to stand up for ourselves. Right after this. Our guest today is Dr. Sunita Sah. Her new book is Defy, The Power of No in a World That Demands Yes. Now, Sunita is a leading behavioral scientist and a professor at Cornell University. She's known for her work on decision-making, ethics, and influence. Basically, Sunita knows exactly why it's so hard for us to say no, and who it's so difficult to say it to. Now, her research can help anyone stand firm against pressure. Today, she's going to share how setting boundaries and focusing on what truly matters can lead to deeper growth in both our personal and professional lives. Here is Dr. Sunita Sah.
I think probably because I had a masterclass in compliance growing up. As a child, I was known for being an obedient daughter and student, and I did what my parents wanted me to. So I got up when I was told to, did all my homework as expected. I even had my hair cut the way my parents wanted me to. And they were all the messages I received, not just from parents, but from my community, from teachers, was to be good. And to be good meant to obey, to comply, to be polite, to be the good girl. And I even remember asking my dad when I was young what my name Sunita means. And he said, in Sanskrit, Sunita means good. So I mostly lived up to that. But I was fascinated by people who were able to defy. And I started to realize that not everyone in authority does the right thing. Yeah. And when I saw teachers behaving in an unfair and unjust manner, and I saw other stories about people in authority behaving in a way that I didn't think was right, I wondered what I would do in those situations. Right. And when I began to study this in more depth, and I discovered that 9 out of 10 healthcare workers, most of them nurses, feel uncomfortable saying no when they see their colleagues making an error. Yeah. And also in a study of 1,700 crew members, about half of them can't say no when they see their superiors making a mistake. Right. So they're life and death situations. And that got me really thinking about, is it sometimes bad to be so good? And what do we sacrifice by disregarding our values every day? And so that inspired my work and research. And what I discovered from that, which really substantially changed how I think, is that we've misunderstood what it means to defy. And we have to reframe that. And that's when I came up with a new definition for defiance that I think is really powerful.
Because this is really the framing for your big idea here.
Right.
What is defiance?
Well, the old definition of defiance is to challenge the power of someone else boldly and openly. Right. Whereas my new definition is that to defy is to simply act in alignment with your true values when there is pressure to do otherwise. Right. And that reframes it from this negative connotation to a proactive, positive force in society.
Okay,
So,
you say negative connotation, and
uh-huh.
I jump right to I come through tech reporting. That's how I come to the seat here today. And so I spent a couple of decades writing about the people who started the internet. And
Mhm.
we celebrated those people for defying. We said, Steve Jobs, you're nailing it. Mark Zuckerberg, you've got a great idea. All of those people were, in fact, white men. I think during that entire period, I wrote about one person of color starting a company who was a man,
Right.
and that's it.
Yeah.
So it strikes me that defiance is celebrated for one category of folks, and kind of what you're talking about is an intense letter of privilege.
That's one aspect of it, yes.
Right.
And that's a great observation because often, when we start with children, for example, we do want them to obey most of the time. And so you get conditioned to think compliance is good and defiance is bad.
Yeah.
And you are rewarded for being obedient. So that's where it starts for many of us, and especially with someone of my background, very much, and yours as well, right? Very much socialize to be good. So maybe those messages come more often to certain people and not to other people. And gender could be one of those aspects. I mentioned Steve Jobs in the book as well. So there is a defiance hierarchy. And when you talk about the disruptive innovation of these people, that is often celebrated. But defiance is more than just disruptive innovation. It's
Right.
also being true to yourself and your values. And often there are costs for defiance, greater costs for defiance for some people
Yeah.
than others. So if you're not the white man, if you are from a less dominant class or different in any way,
Right.
you are often expected to comply so much more. And there's greater costs for defiance. And yet you might have the need to actually defy more. So it might be more necessary for
Because
you
the
to
environment
defy.
around you isn't suited to what you need and what you believe in.
Right. And they expect you to be in a certain way
Right.
where you're expected to be nice, to be good, to be
Mhm.
compliant, to obey, not question back. And when you have all those messages, you actually have a greater need to defy.
This may seem really obvious, but what would you say is like the danger of saying yes?
So the danger of saying yes, we often think about the dangers of saying no, right? And
Yeah.
that keeps us from saying no. We think about, oh, I might lose a relationship. I might lose my job, and that fear of the consequences often holds us back. But they are great costs for being continuously compliant. If you always bow your head to others and go along with that, if you always disregard your values, it affects you emotionally, spiritually.
Right.
It affects you even physically. You can become unwell and depressed and anxious. And so it has these major costs that we often don't think about. It can be soul destroying. I remember feeling muted and drained and having so much tension for many years because I was so compliant.
Yeah.
And so I needed to learn the ability to defy.
Yeah. We're talking about decisions that on the surface seem like they're well understood. I want to go back to just to have an example of something to explore together. Your idea around like medical professionals, particularly nurses, choosing not to speak up in moments when they didn't trust the authority figure around a decision made around someone's health. In truth, what is often true is that there's a lot of gray in there, that this is not binary. This is not that is right or that is wrong. That somewhere in the midst of that, you have to be in touch with how you really feel about it in the first place. And you have to do some weighting around how your opinion gets valued next to the opinion of the authority. Perhaps it's a doctor in a room. How do we think about this more sort of on a spectrum and less as a binary?
Yeah, so I agree with you that often we might have doubts. Right? We might think, oh, I'm not quite sure about that. And one of the dangerous things about that is that when we need to defy, we often feel tension. And this is the first stage of defiance, is that tension. But we often disregard it. And that tension could manifest as anxiety, for example, that I'm not really sure about what's going on here, or I'm just going to smile uncomfortably or even laugh. The way that you express your tension might be different from mine, but certainly I smile or I even have a nervous laugh when something's going wrong. So
I know
that's
that
what I
nervous
do.
laugh.
Yes.
I've got that.
Yes, me too. Or you might feel a lot of doubt, like, oh, I'm sure that other person must be right. Maybe I'm wrong. Or you start to second guess yourself.
Right.
And we just sweep those things under the rug, thinking it's not worth our attention, it's not worth our doubt, because surely the authoritative figure knows more than I do.
Right.
But they might have missed something. And the second stage of defiance is to actually not sweep away that tension, but to really acknowledge it.
Mm-hmm.
And then vocalize it. The third stage to someone else is just to sort of say, I'm not quite sure about that, or I'm uncomfortable with that, or have you considered this? And that third stage is really critical, because if you can get to that third stage and articulate to someone else your tension or your discomfort, then you're more likely to get to the final stage, which is the act of defying and saying, no, I don't think I can go along with that.
It's important here to note that articulation piece, the value of that articulation is actually for you to hear your concern. You're not actually confronting the person or the situation in that moment. That might be what I say to my wife over breakfast, right?
Right. Yeah, that's a great point, is that often you can still be in that submissive position at stage 3.
Right.
You're not telling them or threatening them that you're not going to do anything. You're just vocalizing it. And the really fantastic thing about that from a psychological point of view is that now that you've externally articulated that, you've been explicit in vocalizing it, you can't go back in time later on and say, I think I was okay with it anyway. And so that cognitive dissonance will not allow you to go back and say, oh, I thought it would be okay, because you've already vocalized it. So you're more likely to act in alignment with your values once you've externally expressed that to someone else.
I love the 5 stages, because I think you can map so much of a reaction and an action against these 5 stages. I don't want to leave us. I don't want to move too quickly to stages 4 and 5. I want to stay in our 1 through 3 core. So this week this is very common for me. This is not unusual, but we had a change announced at work. I took in that information and I went home and I thought about it and I didn't think about it. I fed the kids, I got them to bed, I went to bed myself, and I woke up at 4:30 in the morning and couldn't sleep. I was like, I wonder why I can't sleep. Can't sleep. Huh, that's interesting. Read something, fell back asleep. That was my stage 1.
Yes.
And those are the things we often miss, because very often there are things in our environment that are telling us that we need to examine something more closely before our minds will, right?
Exactly. Yeah, your body knows before you do sometimes that, something doesn't feel quite right. I wonder what that is.
Right.
And it can manifest in different ways for different people. So you have to know your tell, whether it's waking up at 4 a.m. in the morning with some anxiety and not realizing what it is, or whether it is, feeling your voice constrict or your throat get tight, or a punch in the stomach, or, feeling butterflies. It can manifest in many different ways, or just even intrusive thoughts. Right? So you have to know and get familiar with what that sign is within your own body. But that's a really powerful sign. Right. And it's your body trying to tell you something, that defiance might be necessary in this situation, and we just need to work through. We need to get past that stage 1.
Right, and that process, by the way, isn't a straight line. And I really want to invite our patience with that process. Knowing yourself well takes time and investment, and getting it wrong a bunch on the way to right?
Exactly. I mean, I've often gone between stages 2 and 3, and then
I think this is what it is. No,
and then come back to complying. Right. And I had to learn, really, really practice to be able to get to stage 5.
We'll be right back with Dr. Sunita Sah. And we're back. Sunita has done so much research on what makes people comply. But there's this other idea she visits, this idea of consent. They sound a little similar, but they're really, really different. That's what we're going to talk about.
Compliance is to go along with something and is externally imposed, something in the external situation. So it could be a peer, an authority figure, the situation, expectations that you have. And to consent is radically different from compliance. I take the definition of informed consent in medicine. So when I learned that in medicine, and I apply it to the decisions we make in our everyday lives, or even critical decisions that we have. And to have consent, there's 4 major elements that you need. Okay. So first of all, capacity, which is your mental capacity. You're not under the influence of drugs, alcohol, illness, or anything like that. So you have the capacity to make a decision. Next is your knowledge of the situation, that you have the information required. And third is that you understand that information, which is critical. So it's not just having the information, it's really understanding it, the risks, the benefits, the alternatives. So once you have those, then you need the freedom to say no, because in certain situations, we might feel that we don't have the freedom to say no, or the cost may be too great, And once you have those 4 elements, then the 5th element is your authorization, which is either an informed consent, a yes, or an informed refusal, which is your no. And those 5 elements must all be present, because if one of them is lacking, then that's not true consent. It's not your true yes. It's simply compliance.
Right. And compliance is not necessarily a bad thing. The gift in your work, you tell me if I've got this really wrong, Sunita, but the gift in your work is that it invites us to think about moments in which we do not consent, but we are choosing to comply because it is the right and safe path. And I want to explore that idea a little bit.
Yes. So I call this conscious compliance, right? That we are aware of it. And that's the difference. It's not the knee-jerk, I'm just going to say yes, sort of default wiring that we have, sort of our wired to comply aspect. It's really understanding the situation and thinking, I have all the elements to consent and I would rather not. But in this situation, I'm choosing to comply. Mm-hmm. I have the capacity, the knowledge, the understanding, the freedom to say no, and yet I'm complying. Why? Because the costs might be too great in this situation. Or it might be something small. It might not be something that really goes against your values. And in that case, if it doesn't go against your values, then why not comply, right? If there's not a great choice, cost to you. But if the costs are very high, you might want to think a little bit more, not to just go along with things and disregard your values, but to defer defiance to a time that's going to be safer and more effective. Mm-hmm. So you want to think about those 2 elements. Is it safe for me to defy? And if it's not, you probably want to think about, is there a time that is a better time for me to defy? So it's not about deferring it forever, but like thinking about what is the right time for me. And will it have a positive impact if I defy? And I just want to add that not everybody needs the positive impact factor. Some people that I interviewed will say that they defied purely because it was really important to their principles. Whether it had a positive impact or not, that was important to them.
You speak about an interview. I'd love to hear a little bit about your process of research for this book.
So the research started early on, right? So I observed a lot of people that could be more defiant than me, and that really fascinated me. And then my research started in medicine, since that was my first career working as a junior doctor in the UK's National Health Service, regarding how patients always mostly comply with their doctors.
The doctor says to do it.
Yes. And the informed consent process there, even though it's there to protect patients, it often isn't real, because how much do you really understand? How much do you feel pressured into just signing on a form without really understanding it? And I'm sure we sign many forms, even outside of medicine, on a daily basis. Like every time I go to the gym, for example, a new gym or something like that.
11 pages of small print, and you look at it and think, well, everyone else is doing it.
Everyone else is doing it. And then if you really look at it, it's like, well, I'm not responsible for your death, even if I'm negligent. And I think, well, really? So we're going to just sign this away. Yeah. And so consent often isn't implemented the way that the ideal requires. And often we don't have all the elements for consent, because in certain situations, to have the full knowledge and understanding is very, very difficult. The doctor knows more than you in most cases. But it is good to think about those things. And then I moved from medicine to other areas where I was just looking at people giving advice in general and giving pretty bad advice. And I ran a lot of experiments looking at how many people complied and why they complied and how they felt about it. And then I did some consulting work for the pharmaceutical industry, and I saw how much they influenced doctors with their marketing, and how the doctors, myself and my friends and colleagues were influenced, and yet we thought we weren't, right? We were certain that we were, we're bright, we're skeptical, we're top of our class. Of course, we're not going to let a pizza lunch affect us.
Where does free will exist in that paradigm?
In terms of accepting?
Well, in terms of, I think the thing that caught my attention there is this sense that really bright people succumb to marketing such that they may not say, it wasn't the pizza lunch that is making me prescribe you this medication, but it is.
Absolutely is. And when I went to do some consulting work for the pharmaceutical industry, I saw that firsthand, right? How they had the return on investment curves, like how many messages, how many times, to which physicians do you get X amount of uplift in prescriptions. And that fascinated me, not just from, oh, yes, this is how you can market and influence people, but what is the impact on the physicians who are rationalizing that they're not affected? What is the impact on the patients? Yeah. And I wanted to study that in more depth. And I was doing my executive MBA at London Business School, and I was speaking to the professors, and they said to me, if you really do want to study that in more depth, you have to go to the US.
So here you are.
So here I am. And I haven't been short of material looking at that aspect. And there's some fantastic work on decision making. And I followed that path to really look at how we make decisions, why we take bad advice, and why we comply so much. And I found in my experiments the really high level of compliance that we have, even in America, which is known to be a society that's very high on individualism. We think we're high on agency, and yet we're complying so much with bad advice. And I uncovered some psychological processes, one of which I call insinuation anxiety, which I've realized is really a powerful force that pressures us into complying with other people, even when we don't want to.
Insinuation anxiety?
Yes.
Okay, so unpack that.
Yeah, so insinuation anxiety is the anxiety that we experience when we don't want to give a negative evaluation of someone to that person.
Oh my gosh, that's like every day of my life.
I know. All right, so I didn't know, I felt this feeling for many years, but I only named it after I started my work in academia, because it came up so often. I was looking at why patients comply with their physicians, especially when they hear a conflict of interest disclosure that, oh, perhaps the doctor has disclosed that, oh, you should enter this clinical trial, but I'm going to receive a referral fee if you do, and I need to disclose that. What I found was that the patients expressed less trust in the advice, which is good. In this particular situation, they weren't experiencing more trust. And that could be the intended purpose of the disclosure. But at the same time, they were telling me that they had much more pressure to comply.
Oh, yeah.
And that the reason, right?
The doctor's bringing you in. It's a personal brokership, right?
Exactly. And also, not just that, it's that now if they say no, if there had been no disclosure prior to that, they could have said no because I don't like those side effects. It sounds too risky. I wish I'd stuck with something that, I want to stay with the drug that I've tried in the past. But now that the doctor's disclosed it, it's more likely to be interpreted that is because of the disclosure that you're saying no. Yeah. And that signals distrust. It insinuates that the doctor could be biased. Right. Or corrupt or unethical or just incompetent, right? And that is what I call insinuation anxiety. Yeah. And it's why the nurses might not have spoken up to their peers, because they don't want to insinuate that somebody else doesn't know what they're doing or that they could be wrong. or why the co-pilots don't speak up to their superiors, the pilots, to tell them that, this is not the right thing to do in this situation.
Well, it correlates with likability, which is particularly important for women, right?
Right. And it's the ability aspect of trust, but also the integrity aspect of trust. And I don't know about you. Sometimes I struggle to tell the hairdresser if I don't like the haircut that they've given. We'll just tip them and go, yeah, that's great. That's exactly what I wanted.
Or I'll eat whatever is put on my plate, even at a restaurant, because saying, hey, you know what, I think you overcooked this would just be, I would be offending somebody. I would hate to do that. I'm fine to just eat the meat tough.
Yes, absolutely. And I remember when I couldn't eat most of my meal and they had the manager come out, I've just noticed that you haven't eaten it. Is there anything wrong? Oh, no, I'm just not very hungry. It's like, what am I doing?
Right.
So it's that insinuation anxiety that's so powerful that once I tell people, I hear so many stories about it, that, oh, yes, I was in this environment, or the contractor in my kitchen told me that I needed to have the sink here and I really didn't want it there. And I just didn't want to tell them that they were wrong. You can have it somewhere else. And it keeps us quiet and mute because we don't want to insinuate that someone is not whom they appear to be.
Is there any part of us, this could be beyond your scope of study, or you could be like, Jesse, you're just full of it. But is there any part of us also that just really wants there to be experts who know more than us about things in the world?
Yeah,
I would like the contractor to know more than I know about where the sink goes. It just would make me feel safer in the world.
We do like that level of authority. I know what I'm doing. And I realized that actually early on when I was a junior doctor, that the way that we get taught to do medicine is take a history and an examination. And one of my first patients, I had taken her history and I was just about to examine her. But before I'd even started, she asked me, "What's wrong with me, doctor?" And I said exactly what was on my mind because I had a list of differential diagnosis. I don't know yet. And I was about to continue and her face just dropped. Oh. And I realized, okay, I'm not supposed to show that level of uncertainty to a patient because that's not what they want to hear, And so I adapted to saying, let me examine you and then we can discuss.
Well, that's an interesting flip, right? Like most of our conversation is about how we manage authority around us and choose where we land.
Yes.
But another thing that a lot of our listeners examine closely is what it means to be authority in the room and what people need to hear from us.
That's right.
And again, I think especially for women, it is uncomfortable to express authority when we don't feel entitled to it or like we own it. There's a little lie that goes into that too.
There is.
Yeah.
And some of my research on confidence actually does show that there is a benefit from being confident in terms of people taking your advice.
Yeah.
But if you are confident and then you turn out to be wrong, there's a bigger penalty. Yeah. So being well calibrated is very important, that you're confident when you know you're right and you express uncertainty when you're not sure. So I think that aspect of being well calibrated is great. But back to your original question is, do we really want people just to tell us what to do? We do want some of the time, but I think some level of healthy consideration, if it's a really important decision, is needed. And especially if you feel something is wrong. If you feel something is wrong and it's not the right treatment for you. There was a big case in the UK where somebody's daughter unfortunately died from sepsis and her parents were really worried about sepsis and they had brought it up, but they were told that they were wrong and it's okay. And it actually led to a new law, Martha's Law, that if you really have doubts and if the parents are feeling like they want a new opinion, a second opinion on this, they will now be a rapid second opinion on their child's cases in these critical events that could be prevented. Yes. And one of the things that they said was just having blind faith is the worst advice possible. So that's the advice of just trust your doctor, just trust can be the worst advice that you ever receive. So you do want to maintain some level of consideration if you are feeling something is wrong.
Right. You also don't have to go in skeptical. Maybe there's a third path, which brings us back to really the through line of your book. Knowing yourself well, understanding when and how to defy. And just before we end, I just want to talk a little bit about what that defiance can look like. Because Steve Jobs is not our only model for defiance, and in fact, probably not the best model for it, right?
Absolutely. And this is one of the things that we've misunderstood about defiance is that it needs to be loud, or you need to have like a larger than life personality, or you need to be heroic. You need to be like Rosa Parks. But it actually is just a practice, not a personality. And you can be defiant in a way that's unique to you with far less angst. You can think about what's most natural for you, whether you want to do it in person or in writing. There's many different ways to be defiant that's personal. And knowing what those ways are, what factors enable your defiance, what factors disable it, and anticipating the situations where we might be required to be defiant. For example, at work, you might have that colleague that is going to make a sexist remark in a meeting. And you have experienced it many times before. And this is how I learned to be defiant, is being in a situation and not speaking up when I really wanted to, and then regretting it afterwards.
Yeah.
And so some of the situations in which defiance is required is just so predictable that you can start anticipating it, because that really helps with defiance, and then visualizing it, and then prescripting what you wish you would have said, your aspirational self, and then practicing it. Because one of the key things I've learned is that defiance is a practice. It's not a personality. It's a skill set, and we can choose to utilize it or not.
That was Dr. Sunita Sah, author of the book Defy, The Power of No in a World That Demands Yes. I'm so glad that Sunita came by to talk with us. She shared so much that it's just really going to stay with me, especially going into a new year. Okay, first, she says it's important to know yourself, and I think about that. I think, what are your real goals? Will saying yes to that next project or opportunity actually get you closer to them? You have to start by understanding that for yourself, right? Okay, second, we are always worried about the fallout from saying no, like missing out or dealing with pushback. But what about the costs of saying yes when you really don't want to? Sunita's research challenges us to rethink how we make decisions and why we feel we have to go along with things, even when maybe we don't want to. Finally, confidence doesn't mean you always have the answers. I'm just going to say that one again, okay? Confidence doesn't mean you always have the answers. Sometimes it's just about being honest, knowing when to stand your ground and when to admit you're unsure. Now, Sunita reminds us it's okay to speak up when you're right and to own it when you don't have all the answers. Now, we're going to talk about this and everything else this week on Office Hours. We'll go live from the LinkedIn news page, just like we always do on Wednesday afternoons at 3 p.m. Eastern. You can find the link in the show notes or in our weekly newsletter, or join the group. You can even drop us a line at hellomonday@linkedin.com, and we'll send it to you. I hope to see you there. Hello Monday is a production of LinkedIn News. Lolia Briggs produced this episode with help from Rachel Karp. Sarah Storm is our senior producer. Sound design and engineering by Saf Gadron. Our theme music was composed just for us by the mysterious Breakmaster Cylinder. Michaela Greer is great at standing up for herself and us. Thank you to LinkedIn's editorial associates, Ali McPherson and Alexandra Kuznetsova. Enrique Montavo is our executive producer. Dave Pond is head of production and creative operations. Courtney Coop is head of original programming. Dan Roth is the editor-in-chief of LinkedIn. And I'm Jessie Hempel. We're back next Monday. I hope you will be too. Thanks for listening.